San Francisco is often called the city of opportunities, but my small apartment on the outskirts feels more like a prison cell. The urban noise outside my window is the only sign of life around me. Days bleed into monotonous evenings, punctuated only by the droning drip of a faulty faucet. It's not just silence, it's a crushing stillness in which I can hear something inside me dying. The constant pain in my neck and shoulder has become my unwelcome companion. Every motion of the mouse sends sharp discomfort through me, and yet graphic design isn't just my job, it's my voice, my way of expressing myself. Now, every keystroke feels like driving another nail into the coffin of my creativity. Tom, my husband, spends his evenings in the garage, fully absorbed in repairing his motorcycle. If he isn't there, he's staying late at work, where his voice, I imagine, must sound more alive than it does at home. We hardly speak. Our rare exchanges have turned into a collection of routine phrases, empty words uttered against the backdrop of an ever-growing distance. Sometimes he looks at me, but there's no warmth in his gaze, only quiet judgment. It's a bitter reminder of how far we've drifted apart in this silent separation. I try not to dwell on the fact that we missed the moment when things could still have been mended, but it haunts me. The moment Tom abandoned his first attempt to reach out, and I stopped searching for a way to connect with him. Now our days tick by like a clock with a broken mechanism. The hands move, but time stands still. In the stillness of the night, I often ask myself questions I cannot answer. Where did I go wrong? Did I trap myself in this dead end, or was it life that set up these snares? Every breath feels like an effort, as if the air resists filling my lungs. Even in my dreams, all I see is this unending ceiling of my tiny apartment. In those moments, I feel the pain in my shoulder and my soul intertwine, a cruel reminder that I'm still here. But for what? I was barely keeping my head above water, days blurred into a gray haze of pain, unbearable fatigue, and a complete lack of will to change anything. This continued until one evening, as Tom drew the curtain and glanced at my laptop, he spoke with quiet resolve. "Emma, you're not managing anymore. You need to do something." His voice was so calm that, for a fleeting moment, I wanted to believe he still cared about me. I looked at him, expecting the usual irritation in his expression, but there was something else, weariness mixed with concern. "Try physiotherapy," he added, his eyes fixed on his own laptop screen. "It might help. You can't keep living like this." I hesitated. The thought of going somewhere, explaining myself to a stranger, felt unbearable. But Tom's words, even spoken with a faint trace of detachment, still struck a chord. Deep down, I knew he was right. This wasn't living. It was mere existence. The next day, I shared my doubts with a friend. Without hesitation, she recommended an old acquaintance of hers, Nick, who ran a small private clinic. I was apprehensive. Nick. I remembered him. We'd met a couple of times at family gatherings years ago. He was the kind of person who smiled more often than seemed natural. There was something simultaneously magnetic and unsettling in his gaze that had always kept me at arm's length. "He's a professional," my friend assured me. "And his methods actually work. That's what you need right now, isn't it?" The next morning, I finally called the number she had given me. Nick's voice on the phone was warmer than I expected, which only heightened my unease. We scheduled my first appointment for the following week. That evening, Tom, noticing my hesitation, delivered the remark that ultimately dispelled my doubts. "If you don't change anything, it's only going to get worse. I'm tired of watching you just disappear." There was no pain in his voice, only exhaustion, and that struck me deeper than I was prepared to admit. The day of my first visit to the clinic arrived faster than I had anticipated. When I stepped into the small office, I was immediately enveloped by warm light and the faint scent of mint oil. The space was cozy, almost homelike, and it helped ease my anxiety just a little. Nick greeted me at the entrance with a broad smile, his brown eyes narrowing slightly as he took me in. "Emma, it's been a long time. I'm glad you came," he said, his voice calm, though I couldn't help but notice how his gaze lingered on me longer than necessary. I chalked it up to an old habit, recalling how he used to study people even back in his younger years. The first session went better than I had expected. Nick began by listening carefully to my story. The confidence in his words and actions inspired trust. He worked gently yet firmly on the muscles in my shoulder and neck, explaining each movement so I'd understand what was happening. "You're holding a lot of tension," he said, pressing lightly on a tender spot. "It's not just physical. Pain is always more than the body." I nodded, though his words made me feel slightly exposed. He was right, of course, but I didn't want him probing any deeper. After a few sessions, the pain began to subside. I could work at my computer again without dreading every movement of the mouse. Nick proved to be not only a master of his craft, but also someone who seemed genuinely invested in my progress. He shared his techniques, explained how they worked, and spoke about them with unfiltered enthusiasm. But over time, something began to shift. Nick started talking less about my health and more about me. His words occasionally felt too personal, though they didn't cross any obvious boundaries. "You've changed, Emma," he said one day, as the session ended. "I see a strength in you that wasn't there before. You've become stronger and more beautiful." His words left me with mixed emotions. On one hand, it felt nice to hear something like that, especially from someone who had been so attentive and supportive. On the other, I felt a subtle tension. The compliment felt unnecessary, but I didn't have the courage to call it out. Maybe because I craved that kind of attention in my life. Soon, his gaze began to linger a little too long. I tried not to give it any significance, but a quiet voice inside warned me, "This isn't entirely right." Still, I ignored it. Between Tom and me, it felt as though an invisible wall had grown. It was thin, almost transparent, but I sensed it in every glance, every word spoken, or left unsaid. More and more often, I caught myself thinking about Nick's words rather than how to restore intimacy with my husband. It was unfamiliar and dangerous. One evening, Tom walked into the kitchen where I was making dinner. His shirt smelled of motor oil, and his face carried the same weariness I now recognized in my own reflection. "Emma," he began cautiously, as if carefully choosing his words, "do you really think this therapist is so essential? Maybe it's worth trying someone else." His question was reasonable, but it struck me like a veiled blow. "Why are you even asking this?" I snapped, placing the knife down on the cutting board. "You're the one who said I needed to change something. Nick is helping. Why does it bother you?" Tom was silent for a few seconds, but his gaze was cold. "I just see that you've changed, and it's not just about your health," he said with a heavy sigh. "You've pulled away. It's like you're not here. I don't even recognize you anymore." His words hit their mark. Denying it was futile, but admitting it felt impossible. "Maybe it's just your imagination, Tom. I'm tired, that's all. I've been fighting this pain all this time, and all you notice is that I've changed. You don't even ask how I'm feeling." I knew I was lying. Tom had tried to talk to me many times, but I always dodged his questions. Now he simply shook his head as if giving up. "Fine, if that's what you think," he said quietly, and without waiting for a response, he walked out of the kitchen. I heard the door to the garage slam, and once again, I was alone. This solitude had become familiar. It no longer frightened me, but it left a bitter taste of regret. Our nights turned into silent coexistence. Tom started coming home later than usual, settling onto his side of the bed and turning away. We barely touched, and this physical distance only deepened the chasm between us. More and more often, I found myself looking for excuses to stay with Nick. I convinced myself it was purely because of his professionalism, his ability to ease my pain. But was that true? Or was I simply drawn to the attention I lacked at home? One evening, as I worked on a project at my laptop, I heard Tom enter the apartment. His footsteps were brisk, purposeful. "Emma?" His voice came from behind me, firm and direct. "We can't keep going like this. What's happening to you?" I turned around. His face was tired, but his eyes glinted with a mix of pain and anger. I wanted to say something to smooth things over, but the words stuck in my throat. "Nothing, Tom," I murmured. Everything's fine." He let out a short, bitter laugh. "You always say that, but I don't believe it anymore," he said, leaving the room and me with the unsettling feeling that this wasn't the start of a conversation, but the end of something important. Every word of his echoed within me, reverberating like a bell. But instead of fighting for us, I sank deeper into my thoughts of Nick, feeling the pull of weakness and improper desires take hold of me. The day began as usual. A gray morning, a cup of coffee, and the ever-present pain, duller now, but still there, a quiet reminder. I prepared for another session with Nick, feeling an odd sense of anticipation. This was no longer just therapy. It had become something I couldn't quite define or name. I told myself it was simple gratitude, but deep down, I knew it was more than that. At the clinic, everything was familiar. The scent of mint, the soft lighting, Nick's smile, just a touch warmer than it needed to be. Today he was particularly talkative, sharing stories about his new techniques and anecdotes from his practice. I listened intently, almost mesmerized by his voice. It was soothing, but when he began the massage, I felt something shift. His touch today felt too personal. Gentle, almost tender strokes across my back and shoulders made me tense up. I tried convincing myself it was just his professional approach, but the unease grew stronger. Then he leaned in slightly, and his voice came softly, almost whispering in my ear. "Emma, you have no idea how much you've changed. You're not just overcoming the pain, you're blossoming. It's inspiring." His words hung in the air, too intimate, too close. I tried to change the subject, standing abruptly to grab my bag. "Thank you, Nick. I think that's enough for today," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. But he didn't step back. His gaze lingered on me too long, and in it, I saw not just admiration, but something else, something that made me uneasy. "Emma, you know you can trust me. If you ever feel lost, I'm here, always," he said, his voice soft, almost intimate. I felt something inside me tear. I wanted to leave, but part of me clung to those words, to the feeling of being seen, of being alive. I stayed in his office for another hour, and then it happened. When I returned home, Tom was already there. He was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, his gaze piercing. "How did it go?" he asked, his tone deliberately calm. "It was fine," I replied quickly, avoiding eye contact. His silence was heavier than words. He knew I was lying, and I knew I was continuing to destroy whatever was left between us. "Tom?" I froze in the doorway. "You're home early. Did something happen?" He looked up, and in his eyes I saw pain, betrayal, and anger. His voice was low but resonated with barely contained emotion. "Yes, Emma. Something did happen." I took a step forward, but he stopped me with a gesture, pointing to the screen. My heart began to race. On the monitor, I saw a video from Nick's clinic. A camera, mounted in the corner of the office, had captured everything. "What is this?" My voice trembled. Tom stood, shutting the laptop as though to shield himself from the images he had just seen. "What is this?" he repeated, his voice rising to a shout. "This is your— Everything's fine, Emma. This is your helper. I trusted you, and you—" I tried to respond, but the words caught in my throat. What could I possibly say? Tom clenched his fists, fighting to contain himself, but the rage spilled out. "How could you do this to me? How could you let him touch you, look at you like that?" "Tom, I don't know how to explain this," I stammered, tears welling up in my eyes. "It wasn't intentional. I got confused. He cut me off, stepping closer. "Confused? Confused? Do you think that's an excuse?" He exhaled sharply, lowering his head. When he spoke again, his voice was almost a whisper. "Do you realize this is the end?" I reached out, trying to touch his hand, but he pulled away. "I'm filing for divorce, Emma," he said, refusing to meet my gaze. "I can't live like this anymore. I've lost you, and now I can't keep fighting for something you've already destroyed." I stood there, crushed by his words. Tom walked into the bedroom, leaving me in a silence that felt heavier than ever before. After that night, my life began to crumble like a row of dominoes. Tom kept his word. Within a week, I received notice of the divorce. He avoided me, refused to talk. When I tried to find the words to explain, he looked at me with the expression of someone who was too tired of being hurt. His decision was final. Tom didn't just leave my life, he took everything that gave it meaning. Our friends sided with him, having heard his version of events. Many of them, even without knowing the full truth, began avoiding me. The feeling of being rejected by everyone was far more crushing than I could have imagined, but that was only the beginning. Tom filed a formal complaint against Nick with the professional association. His lawyers submitted the footage from the clinic's camera to the ethics committee. The same video that had destroyed my marriage now threatened to ruin Nick's career. The scandal erupted quickly. Clients stopped coming to his clinic. Doctors who once respected him turned their backs the moment they heard his name. A newspaper published an article about how a successful physical therapist had abused a patient's trust. Nick tried to defend himself, but the evidence was irrefutable. My job also became jeopardized. Someone at work learned about the situation, and rumors spread rapidly. Every time I entered the office, I felt the weight of their judgmental stares. At first, they whispered behind my back, but eventually they began avoiding me entirely. One day, my manager called me into his office. "Emma," he said, avoiding eye contact, "we value your work, but your reputation puts us in an awkward position. I think you should take some time off, a long-term leave." It felt like a sentence. I left the office feeling hollow. Without a job, without a family, without friends, I was utterly alone. My small apartment, which had always felt like a prison cell, now became a cage, trapping me with nothing but my own guilt. I couldn't stop blaming myself, first for letting things go too far with Nick, then for destroying my marriage, and finally, for allowing my entire life to spiral into this abyss. It seemed that everything I valued had been destroyed by my weakness, my inability to stop sooner. One day, I received a letter from Nick. His words were filled with bitterness and resentment. "You're guilty too, Emma. If you had said no earlier, none of this would have happened." His words cut into me like a knife. He was right, but I couldn't change it. All I could do now was try to move forward somehow, with whatever pieces of myself were left. It all began with emptiness. No calls, no meetings, no familiar routines to distract me from my thoughts. The first weeks were like falling into a chasm, and each new day was a battle to climb just one step higher. It was slow, painful, but necessary. I knew that either I would start moving forward, or I would vanish completely. One day, I booked an appointment with a psychotherapist. The decision wasn't easy, but during the very first session, I realized how much I needed to speak. There was no judgment, no blame, just someone listening and asking the right questions. Slowly, I began to untangle my emotions. I understood that my actions weren't just a mistake, they were a cry for help that no one, not even I, had heard in time. At the same time, I started searching for work, but in San Francisco, every door seemed firmly shut. Reputation, rumors, they all followed me relentlessly, so I made a decision. I had to leave. Moving away became a symbolic act. I left the city that reminded me of pain and failure, and I went somewhere no one knew me. A small town in Oregon welcomed me with a cool breeze and the scent of pine trees. I rented a tiny house and began working remotely, illustrating children's books. It had always been just a hobby, but now I poured everything I had into it. It became my way of restoring faith in myself, that I could create something good and bright despite the chaos I had left behind. The work brought a sense of fulfillment. Every line, every detail on the pages of those books was an attempt to build a world better than the one I had shattered. Gradually, I began to feel like I was moving forward, step by step. One day, I was invited to a conference for illustrators. It was unexpected, but I agreed, deciding it was time to step out of my shell. The conference was in Portland, and as I arrived, I felt a faint excitement I hadn't felt in ages. That was where I saw Tom again. I noticed him in the crowd, and my heart skipped a beat. He saw me too. For a moment we both froze, as if time itself had stopped. Then he walked toward me, and I found it hard to breathe. "Emma," he said, his voice calm but tinged with sadness. "I didn't expect to see you here." "Tom?" I nodded, searching for the right words. "I didn't expect this either. How are you?" He smiled, but it was a cautious smile. "I'm living, trying. And you?" "I'm working, trying too," I replied. We stood there, surrounded by the noise of the conference, but for me all of it faded away. Just his face, his gaze, which seemed different now. There was no longer anger in his eyes, only weariness and something resembling acceptance. "I've forgiven you," he said quietly, looking down. "But I can't forget." Those words cut like a knife, and yet felt like salvation at the same time. I nodded, knowing there could be no other response. "I understand, and I'm sorry, Tom, for everything," I said, feeling tears well up in my eyes. He nodded in return, and we said no more. He walked away, leaving me standing alone. But I didn't feel as lost as I once had. That moment became a definitive end for me. Not of my story, but of a chapter. It wasn't closure. It was the start of something new. I knew my past would always be with me, but it no longer defined who I was. Each day became a chance to be better, to build a new life, and maybe one day find my own happiness again. The road ahead was long, but I believed I had everything I needed to walk it.